Hello, I'm Professor David Marshall, and as you can see here, this is my presentation of my keynote address at the World Conference of Arts, Humanities, Social Sciences, and Education on the 24th of October 2022 in the wonderful city of Valencia. Let's blow that up a little bit so you can see it a bit better. Digital sentiment, the central title of this presentation, blends two parts of our world that we rarely think of as in any way unified. Digital, to begin with, and traditionally over the last 70 years, refers to the conversion of calibration through mathematics into computer-related culture. Putting these two components of our culture together, mathematical to digital, with the identification and calibration of affect, emotion, sentiment, defines a large component of our contemporary lives and how our contemporary lives are organized and related. And let's go on to our next slide here. How can we understand this continuous reading of emotion and sentiment in our lives? To the left of this opening slide, as you can see, I'm hoping you're seeing those starlings in motion. Their reactions to each other, their decisions about their collective direction are built from the affective reaction that each has to the ultimate objectives of their group. Digital culture plays into this human affective reaction. And let's go on to our next slide here. And what is clear is the very etymological link between what is called emotion and motion. And this slide here is very much, still has the starlings over to the right, but is very much just the full version of this keynote address in an abstract version. But I'm going to talk about other things. So I'm just going to pull it out to a version of just mainly me here. Philosophers have dealt with this. And what is clear that I want to make is the very etymological link between what is called emotion and motion. Philosophers provided some of the origins of how emotion and sentiment are connected to motion. Spinoza used the word affectus, but St. Augustine, Plato, and Aristotle linked emotion to human, again, motion. The observation of starlings, a little thing that we saw a little earlier, and I'm going to show again, that I'm privileging here because it defines how emotion is sometimes not fully positioned and yet is in starling culture, wherever those starlings are. Brian Masumi, linked with Deleuze's concept of societies of control, developed the allusion to starling movement to explain how individuals move into affect that is at least partially identifiable by their relation to others. Let's head on into that next one. And let's go, if we can, a little bit bigger with that sort of image there. So as you can see, the moving image of starlings is fascinating to see the reaction to direction by each individual bird, but equally how these reactions create a collective formation and movement. Affect is something that moves us into a kind of attribution to cultures, industries, and others. And its massive integration into our online worlds and cultures is, yes, done by ourselves, but also reconfigured by the related industries of the internet and social media. Let's move on to our next slide for a second here. And I'll pull myself into this image just so you can see what I'm getting into. It's far from identical but the starling's affective collective judgments provide a good way to understand our quite elaborate conversion of our sentiments in and through digital culture. Integrated through what can be called from linguistic characterizations as emotional emblems, percolate in and through our online social media replatformization of ourselves in everyday life. What needs to be fully investigated to move us towards understanding the conversion and hybridization of humanity, human culture, personally, interpersonally, and what even could be called mass netcasting or digital sharing is the real conversion of our emotional expressions in this new, normalized online environment. As you can see, I've grouped this communicative conversion into the list of key emblems. I'm in the back of the screen here so you can keep seeing me. These key emblems, the first one, hashtags, which circulate throughout our online experiences across different forms of engagements, more than one engagement, of course. Emoji, relatively new, not brand new, and variations of these images of expressions have circulated around for the last century, but intensified, and that used to be called emoticons, but intensified under computer culture in the late 20th century and then became standardized in the last 15 years by major players such as Apple and Google and beyond. Let's go on to that third one listed there. Facial expression recognition, a science and social science description that has floated through researchers for centuries, but now beyond photography into digital patterning and allocation of sentiment and what we now visually express, how we now visually express ourselves. We are given some control of this form of expression digitally, possibly resembling cosmetics, but also something that is at least algorithmically connected to the online industries and platforms. The final one listed here, but it is by no means less impactful, is the new tradition of memes. The term itself developed almost 50 years ago to describe a kind of scientific evolutionary structure around ideas and thoughts with genetic connotations. And it was developed by Richard Dawkins, an evolutionary biologist. It now is a term that works to describe usually humor, but other forms of sharing through online platforms to gather connections, like a new comic phrase would have done under broadcasting or even print communication, like newspapers over the last 200 years. I will go into greater detail around these forms of digital expression and conversion, but first I think it is important to know the nuance and difference between the related concepts that identify these forms of digital expression and feeling. I have listed these, as you can see over to the right. Sentiment, derived from the French and medieval Latin, is the term that fits together some of the approaches used over human culture's attempt at understanding an understanding of feeling, sentiment. The word emotion, second one there, is derived and linked since ancient Greece to movement, motus, and variations of this form of linkage to motion are apparent across the languages of Eurasia. Movement and motion are also attached in interesting ways to our technological conversion of stories and narratives. Here, briefly think of the notion of motion pictures, moving images, even animation to a degree. Perhaps emotion and affect have a particular link to their lack of full allocation as emotion and sentiment do. Affect, as you can see, is the next thing there, as briefly mentioned above, is a reactive moment to a condition that may or may not be fully attributed to understanding and sometimes leads to a neurophysical reaction. like the starling flocks. David Marshall speaking. Just to get to that point, affect is, as briefly mentioned earlier, a reactive moment to a condition that may or may not be fully attributed to understanding and sometimes leading to a neurophysical reaction. Like the starling flocks in motion that served as our interpretive and conceptual introduction to this world of digital emotion and sentiment. So it's not that affect is full understanding. Affect is, in a sense, almost before we understand our emotion. It's a sense. It's as I could probably do right now in terms of just getting to an idea of just expressing something that stops and starts someone is kind of the beginning of its attribution. Doesn't mean that I'm not reacting to something outside, something in front of me, but it doesn't mean that I fully attributed it to a meaning of understanding. All of these emblems are active, affective, meaning attribution. That last one there, meaning attribution, that pulls us into their digital use, reading and reuse. These patterns of use and reuse and related patterns of affect to emotion are in effect and generally forms of meaning attribution in online and digital culture. Social media has many more narratives, many more stories, but it is a grouping of emotional to application directions through these emotional carriers of sentiment and its form of related information, connection, community formation, and engagement. Let's pop on to the next slide here. And we're going to need to go big here, so I'll just try my best to go as large as possible. What I've developed to describe the variations of affect, emotion, and sentiment move through and are deployed in our online and digital culture. How affect, emotion, and sentiment move through and are deployed in online digital culture are two concepts. In a way, they are all linked to my research on persona, but to get us through the emotional configurations, it is useful to think of our forms of expression through the emblems we regularly use to express ourselves or connect to expression, meaning, and connection online. That is memes, emoji, hashtags in particular, and the digital reconfiguration of facial expression recognition. So, we all negotiate how we present ourselves in the variety of social media platforms that billions of us use regularly. To define this individual reading of collective activity and individual engagements, also into collective relationships, I use the concept of, and you'll see it on the left there, curation. As much as we want to imagine our persona is an individual, it is best to think of it as a dividual. Persona defines a strategic, partially fictive way in which we present ourselves as we move into social and collective spaces. The term dividual itself, developed by Masumi via Deleuze, in its form of etymology as well, is, as you can see, divided. Yes, it's a term that we use, individual to divided. The curation, then, as we present ourselves in some way, is to move from the self to its place in the world. This is clearly what we curate, our digital identity, as best that we can on different social media platforms. But also, across other online experiences, including texting, streaming, searching, and so on in the myriad of activities that are part of how we present ourselves online. Individual as a term expresses an undivided self. Dividual identifies the kind of persona, negotiation, that's what we negotiate, and a knowing of a duality that will become clearer to explain as all of us curate and work out how we intersect with elaborate forms of what I identify on the screen as well. Correlation on your right. Correlation is related to our curating, but it is the industrial models of what I generally call the intercommunication industries that manage, shape, and work out ways for the flow of finances that are connected to our curating activity. Correlation, it has to be understood, is how an industry reads us and puts us into collective patterning based on the kinds of sentiment emblems we use individually and are, to be clear, reconfigured as to our sentiment and our attachments to other online patterns and forms of programmatic advertising. This reading of individuals is also a constructed identity that is partially defined from the 20 to 30 year history of affective computing by our Professor Dr. Rosalind Picard of MIT researchers that has worked how our sentiments can be correlated and converted into digital representations and presentations. This work has also been central to what is often called haptic reading in video and computer games, where sentiment is determined originally by activity, pulse, feeling of hands, and reactions sometimes to touch stimulus. But overall, what has developed over the last 20 years and even earlier is a kind of algorithmic reading of activities that emerges from how computer science has structured pathways. As it moves to interpret our online identities, it being computers, from our activities, the algorithmic reading of our sentiments, desires, and goals and activity online has been very effectively understood and converted into mathematical formulas. David Sumter's related work, a definitive mathematician who has worked in the interpretation of the self into codes and categories that are quantitatively defined by recurring actions, has investigated what he calls principal component analysis, or PCA. It is a building of codes